Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Hey, Ariel. Wow,
hey,
that was a great podcast with Debbie Zacarian, Margarita Calderon, and Margo Gottlieb. Talking about Beyond Crisis, which is their new book. They come in with such great expertise.
And so much passion. Yeah. You just see it, and hopefully listeners can just hear it radiating from them. I love that.
Yeah, I think their background really, even though they've got this expertise, they went in, and one of the things we talked about in the podcast is that they went into this whole topic on multilingual learners and engaging multilingual learners with such curiosity. And I think that was important, but let people know what the background for Debbie, Margarita, and Margo.
Yeah, so Debbie Zacarian is the founder of Zacarian and Associates. She's a past district administrator and has tons of experience in Boston Public Schools. Margarita Calderon is the professor emerita at Johns Hopkins University and was previously with the U.S. Department of Education. And Margo Gottlieb is the co-founder of WIDA at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. So, I mean, talk about just a blockbuster triad of authors. Not something you see every day.
I loved how I was so glad to be able to talk about how the three of them came into contact with each other in the first place, because as a guy that I write my books alone. So it's always interesting to me when you've got three people who are writing a book. I'm like, how does that work? So their backstory is just really great. So I'm glad we were able to get into that. But what was your favorite part of the podcast?
I think Margarita says at one point, it's not just about re-engaging multilingual learners, but it's often about engaging them for the first time. And that just hit me. And I was like, I'm sure that is so true in so many cases. But all three of them talk about just the importance of school leaders getting curious and being in regular communication with parents and families, and really starting from that strengths-based approach. That was definitely a core theme, is coming at it with that strengths lens.
And I loved how because the book is called Beyond Crisis, I like how they gave so many school stories of, like, not only did they have the research and they were talking about practice, they were giving school stories about how it looks in practice. And I think those can be very powerful for people. So I'm very excited for everybody to listen to our podcast. That we have a lot of experience now, right?
That's right. We're pros at this point.
Well, I hope everybody enjoys the podcast, and Ariel, I'll see you on the other side.
All right, let's get to it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. I am very excited. We're continuing our discussion about reimagining engagement, and I have three authors here who have a few interesting stories, actually, that we're going to get into during this podcast. But my guests are Debbie Zacarian. See, Debbie, look at that. I was perfectly fine off air, but Debbie Zacarian, Margarita Calderon, and Margo Gottlieb, and they are the authors of a new book called Beyond Crisis, Overcoming Linguistic and Cultural Inequities in Communities, Schools, and Classrooms. Welcome to Leaders Coaching Leaders.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not often that I have the pleasure of interviewing three authors, three co-authors. That's pretty amazing to be able to do that. So how did the three of you get together in the first place? Because this is not your first book, correct? But how did your relationship start in order to get to this book? Debbie, how about you? You seem like you have the story.
I don't know that I have the story. I have my story, but we've all written or co-written many books. So we've all been in the field for a long time. And I had the amazing opportunity of meeting Margarita many years ago when I was a consultant for the Boston public schools, and they were found to be in non-compliance, like many districts are, and they hired the U.S. Department of Justice, or should I say the U.S. Department of Justice became involved with the Boston Public Schools, and their expert was Dr. Calderon, and I was the expert on the other side of the table. And to all of our good fortune, Margarita is incredible to work with and was just a really gracious, wonderful expert that really helped Boston in a great way. And then years later, one of my editors, Dan Alpert at Corwin, asked me if I would like to be fixed up on a blind date to write a chapter in a co-edited book with another co-writer. And I asked Dan who the book was being edited by. And when he mentioned Margo Gottlieb, I said, well, it won't be such a blind date because I know Margo. And that led to my co-writing a chapter in Margo's amazing series on academic language. And with my co-writer, Michael Silverstone, I've written a few books since that first go-round, that first chapter that we wrote together. So many years later, we've reunited. We wrote the best-selling book with some other co-writers called Beyond Crises. It's back here, Breaking Down the Wall. Before Beyond Crises, we wrote that book, which became a bestseller almost immediately. And then Dan approached the three of us to write this new book. And that's how we've been working and collaborating together.
That's wonderful. That's pretty unique to be across the table from each other and then start a relationship that way. Margarita, how is this Beyond Crisis about re-engaging multilingual learners? Why was this important for you to be a part of and write?
Because it's really important to have more evidence-based approaches to re-engaging multilingual learners. To engage them in the first place would be more accurate. And so we all have this rich background of working in schools, not just the whole school district like Boston, but other whole districts that have been very interested in excelling in what they're doing for multilingual learners. So we have lots of interviews, principals, language specialists. We've been embedded in schools for many years. And so we bring that in the book to discuss approaches to whole school in exchanges, collaboration, to make sure that multilingual learners are experiencing success.
Margo, I want to ask you, so as language experts, all three of you, what has been the biggest weakness to the approach schools have taken for multilingual learners in the first place? Because I know that Margarita was just talking a little bit about it's really not about re-engaging, it's more about engaging in the first place. So what has sort of been the biggest weakness about the way schools have tried to engage in the past?
I hate to work from a deficit perspective because we have spent so much time trying to change.
No, but we're going to go there. We're going to go there though. But I want to talk about the weakness first before we go into that.
I will. I think the weakness comes from a position of power. Mm-hmm. That many times schools have not honored or valued multiple languages and cultures. Mm-hmm. And they have not accepted the traditions and the assets that the families and multilingual learners are bringing. And they don't see through the lenses of those, of the children that they serve. I would say that's the major weakness. They don't embrace multilingualism and multiculturalism. And it's in Debbie and Margarita's mind, passion in life. It's just so hard to think about engagement. And so we thought that this book would really kindle that. Mm-hmm. And hopefully get everyone excited about the positive roles that multilingual learners and their families can play.
Yeah, I think in order, and I love the strengths-based approach that you took, I think in order for people to understand where they need to begin. I think they also need to understand that the deficit mindset they've had in the past has not served them well. And that's one of the things, whenever I'm interviewing experts like yourselves about equity and race, one of the things that really comes out is the whole idea of a deficit mindset on the part of a teacher or a school leader or something like that. So I really appreciate the fact that in your in the book, which actually comes out this month. So congratulations on that. I forgot to say that at the beginning. Congratulations. It's always exciting to have a new book out, especially something as important as the topic that you're focusing on. In there, you talk about from three different standpoints when you're within the book. You've got imagining communities, imagining schools, and imagining classrooms, but you definitely have the word strengths-based in there. So when we're talking about imagining communities and we're looking at strengths-based, what are some of the things that school leaders and teachers can do right now as they're looking at this present time where they might be still dealing with, or we're all dealing with COVID, but also in what could be a reboot in the future too? How do we actually imagine communities from a strengths-based approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we, ask ourselves too, how do we reboot, restart? What kinds of things do we need to think about? And, your question about a deficit-based to an asset-based is a really good one, because every field, psychiatry, social work, psychology, and education really operated off a deficit-based approach as, short as 30 years ago. And then a lot of research has come out that's, led to an abundant amount of research that talks about the very importance of using a strength-based approach to really look for students and families' assets and our community's assets. So, what are the assets that all of our communities or our local communities have? And a very first step would be to really look at how particular schools have really taken steps to find their English learners or their multilingual, multicultural learners' assets and strengths. And how do they draw from those in the questions they ask, in the types of information that they gain, and in the activities that they have students and families engage in. And what we talk about are schools across the country, what they've been doing during COVID and hopefully beyond COVID to really keep students engaged, to keep their families involved. An example is Wolf Street School in Baltimore, where the principal, Mark Gaither, has really been working very hard for the past 10 years to involve every family and every student. And what he does that's quite unique to that school is the school's morning meeting, and it's a primary school, but morning meeting is a meeting that's had with families, teachers, and students. They all come first thing in the morning, and they have this morning meeting. Well, then COVID happened. So how do you have morning meeting? Well, with the parents' help, they have it remotely or by phone or on WhatsApp or whatever. And they've continued morning meeting to really gather the community together. And that's been a great help because the students and their families really wanted the students involved in after school work. So what's happened during COVID, families and community members using their strengths and assets have offered a lot of after-school programming, which is great. So not only is school continuing, but a lot of their after-school programs are continuing as well remotely. And that really speaks about harnessing the power of strengths. So, in short, it's really taking time to be curious and work closely with students and families and ourselves.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me, when I was an elementary school principal, we used to have magic moments 3 mornings a week. And that was just one of my favorite times. I'd sort of forgotten that was in the back of my mind, Debbie, until you just started talking about that, which I think is so great. What about when we're looking at imagining schools? Margarita, what is, I know you do a lot of school-based work with large districts and schools. So when we're talking about imagining schools, where do you usually start with them?
At the school district level, because if they're not engaged, it's very difficult for school principals to want to take something on that's going to be comprehensive. It's going to take a couple of years. And the focus is on English language learners, which typically doesn't happen, right? there's usually either science or math or something else. But when we're talking about English language learners, multilingual learners, then that's a whole different story. So it starts at the school district, and then the principals become involved in learning about what we could do this year, next year. And then principals and their leadership teams sign on to become more aware. And one of the things that we have discovered is that if all teachers in the school can start almost right away, it really helps. Small pockets of teachers that go through the training, professional development, it just doesn't go very far. And so the principals maybe split the faculties in half. Okay, you do it this semester, the other half next semester. But it's a whole school approach that has worked, and we see that not only are the multilingual students doing so much better, showing growth, but even the teachers, the AP teachers tell us that students in the AP classrooms are doing so much better and better in their SATs and other kinds of state tests. So that's how we have found that schools can really make a difference.
Can we go a little bit deeper? And I'll throw this out to all three of you, because I work with a lot of principals and teachers, and they've got a lot of initiatives, and everybody looks at their initiative as the most important and those kind of things. And we know that the implementation dip can certainly kill some of this work as well, right? Because people get very tired. We know that self-efficacy is a factor, especially when we're talking about multilingual learners, because there are people that don't feel confident, so they don't feel like they have the expertise. How can your book better help them for those? Because I think it's great to talk about like how we can get, the whole school moving and everybody on board, but we know that that's not always the case, because there are teachers that don't want to be on board. In fact, I just had some conversations with people earlier before this podcast that talked about this. So how can your book, and I know it can, how can your book specifically help those people keep the momentum going, so this isn't just another initiative that it's this too shall pass? Mm-hmm. Who would like to take that question?
I could start it. I think one of the outgrowths of this pandemic is the humanization of education. That for a long time, what you said, Peter, was right. We've gone from one initiative to another one, or one policy to another, and we haven't sat back and had time to self-reflect. And I think with this emergence of social emotional learning and the importance of self-advocacy, and for multilingual learners to see themselves that school is part of their identity formation, but just as valuable is their home life as well. And what we've tried to do, I don't know if you noticed, but we put communities first, mm-hmm. and classrooms are last. And we view this as intersecting, interdependent, three ecosystems. And together they form a very strong bond. And I think by appealing to the humanistic side of education, we can draw everybody in, because everyone's human.
Margo, that's such a great thing to say. You're absolutely right. I have found that a lot of the conversations have been about being more human, which is kind of, it's hard, right? You think, because it's common sense, like we should always be doing this. But even, when I got hired to write my blog for Education Week, 10 years ago, I was hired to write about social emotional learning, and I used to get the biggest pushback from that topic. Like I would get emails from people that said there's no place for that in schools, which I just was so against the common sense that I had. But it does seem like after March of last year, the humanist side is something that's more important. And we're also trying to get more in touch with the equity side too. And I think that word equity has certainly progressed our understanding of it and all of that. So yes, I did notice for sure. In fact, when we were talking earlier, I said you started with imagining communities and then imagining schools, and now you've got imagining classrooms. So I want to tell you, I used to teach first grade, and I was in a high poverty city school, but it was very diverse. I grew up in the Adirondacks in a very white suburban school district, and I loved the diversity of the school where I was outside of New York City. And there were things like I wanted to make sure that the books, the picture books and the books that I had in my classroom were positive representation of the kids that were sitting in the classroom. But I also remember back then that equity was not something we were always doing right, because it was coming from a very white perspective. So when you're looking at imagining classrooms, what can people do right now? Maybe it's not even that they have to go out and do something different. Maybe they can actually look within their classroom right now and say, oh, wait a second, I'm already doing this. Okay, this isn't about completely starting new and all this stuff. I'm already doing some of this. So what are those kind of things that you talk about in the book where imagining classrooms? And I don't want you to give away so much information that people don't buy the book either. So, who can find the balance for me here?
I'll start again because I'm more familiar with the classrooms, and then I'll let everyone join in. But I think teachers are coming to understand that classrooms are a microcosm of their schools and of the communities and of society. And that wasn't recognized before, believe it or not, because I too was a first grade teacher. It's really ironic, in Chicago. That's how I started my career a long time ago. And I think that once teachers understand the richness of multilingualism and multiculturalism, and they embody it in their classrooms, it will be, and all teachers want their children to be successful. I mean, you've got to admit that. And when you have this diversity of beautiful faces in front of you, you want them to succeed. And so I think this is a natural extension of the demographic shift.
Yeah.
And I'll let other people jump in.
Debbie, what about you? Oh.
What? Okay. What about me? And I think that's a really great question too, is what can we do right now, right? And typically what we've done with all students is we ask traditional questions and we hold these traditional meetings. So it might be at enrollment, what language did your child first learn to speak? Where did they go to school? They're very impersonal questions. And what we're learning is that all of those traditional activities that we've been doing and need to do, along with parent-teacher conferences, open house, curriculum night, have been wonderful for a certain population and have really disenfranchised many, many students and their families. So what we talk about in the book is, yes, let's meet with parents, but what kinds of questions could we really ask them that would really help us to build programs that are really about their children and really for them too, because we want them to be our partner. So one way of doing it is tell us what your child is interested in. What special talents does your child have? Tell me about a school they really enjoyed or what they enjoyed about school. And even if it's recess, whatever the parent shares is really important, or a child shares is really important. And then simply asking parents, how were you involved in your child's prior school? Or how would you like to be involved here? Instead of shoving information at families, really be curious, take some time to get to know one another and have activities that are really social. So one of the examples that we use in the book, we provide a lot of them along with surveys and protocols and ways of operating, is one of the schools that we interviewed typically held a potluck supper to, be a social event. Well, during COVID, having a potluck supper is kind of the opposite of what you'd want to do. So wonderfully, our book talks about how to empower students right away too. So the school asked the students, what would you like to do in place of the potluck supper? And what did the students say? They wanted a potluck supper at their home where their family could share a meal. And they would all be on Zoom like we are here. And they did that, and the kids created a recipe book. So there are wonderful things that we can do right now to re-engage, rekindle, bring learning alive that really speak to the heart of using our strengths, all of ours, and making it work. And we're really excited about, learning from one another, which we did in the process of writing this. And also we learned a lot from what schools are doing right now to make it happen.
I love that. Asking parents, how do you want to be engaged with school, right? Because I think people have misperceptions or they have biases, all of those kind of assumptions that can happen too. So that's a great question. What I also like about what you just said, Debbie, I think is an important ingredient for how the three of you wrote the book. And that's that you didn't go into, you all have these amazing backgrounds with a deep level of expertise, but you still went into the book as what can I learn through the writing of the book? And I think those are the best books to read because you can tell you've used, a few of you have used the word curious. And I think that when you've got authors who are actually curious about the topic that they're writing about, which I know might sound insane to some people outside of this, but the reality is some people write a book based on their expertise and they want everybody to know what they should know about this topic. You walked into it saying, I know this about the topic, but I've learned this about the topic. And I think that's such a wonderful way to write a book. Margarita, what about you? What do you have to add to those pieces about the classrooms and what people can do right now?
Listen to teachers. The teachers have always been in my heart, and everything I do has been for teachers. We need to empower teachers more. Everywhere I go, core content teachers tell me, I want to do something for English learners, but I don't know how. I don't know what to do. And so we need to think about that from their perspective. It's not that they don't want to help. They just haven't been given the tools. And that's where we begin by sharing, okay, here are some things. Now, let's begin gradually. Let's just start with one little aspect like vocabulary, teaching vocabulary. And let's work on that for a couple of months. We will go in and coach you. You will learn how to coach each other. The follow-up, and here are the tools for everything you need for that. And then you go on to how do I teach reading comprehension in biology and chemistry, and so on and so forth. So a gradual, success-filled approach for teachers is what really helps. Teachers want to be effective, but we need to listen to them first. And just like children and us and everybody else, some are ready right away, but others have to see what's going on and then they jump in. And that's why, the whole school helps them to learn from each other, just like we did. And that's the kind of context we want to create in school for teachers.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, I have a couple of minutes left. So I want to ask you a question that I haven't asked on the podcast yet. So Debbie, you mentioned a couple of stories that I think are really important. And it made me think that so many readers love a good case study. Like they love a good story about how does that look in a school. And you've mentioned a couple so far, which I think are great. So what I'd like to do is give readers, potential readers, more of a teaser right now. So I don't want the whole story because that way they'll want to open the book and read about it. But out of the stories that you focused on within the book, what is the favorite one that you walked away from saying, wow, I really like that? And can you give just a little bit of information on it, but not the whole story because I want people to be able to read it? Are there those that are in there? I'm seeing you think. So okay. I'm going to call on, do you have one?
Yeah, sure. I have one, and it's in my state, Massachusetts.
Okay.
And it's a great school, Brockton Public Schools. And highlight. Oh, good. Okay. Well, if you know them and you love them like we do, their superintendent, Mike Thomas, and their director of English learners and their bilingual bicultural team told us what they did on Friday, the day schools closed because of COVID, to make sure they took care of not just their students and their families, but themselves, because it was and probably is one of the most affected cities with the pandemic. So what did it do to really help its students, its families, and themselves?
Brock, that's a great one. Brockton does so many great things. So I'm looking forward to that. Margo, what about you? Did you have a story in there that you like?
We collected case studies, not only from principals, but from teachers. Mm-hmm. And so what I find interesting, first of all, no one was an expert in COVID. This pandemic was an equal opportunity, disaster. Yeah. And so we were all scrambling and all grappling with all these new situations. And so we asked teachers point blank, imagine a post-COVID world. What will happen? What will your classroom look like? And one of the teachers, his name is Michael Silverstone, and he's from we like Massachusetts, okay, Debbie? and so what I found so fascinating is he said that he imagined when his students come, because right now some are hybrid, some come trickling into the schoolroom, some are still remote, and where they're all together again, they are going to be grateful. They're going to have gratitude for the opportunity to interact with each other, to see learning as a social activity. And they didn't appreciate it before. And they think there will be a renewed appreciation of teaching and learning. And hopefully that will come to bear.
That's awesome. And Margarita, what about you? What was one of your favorite stories? But don't give too much information.
Okay. Well, this is sort of an ironic story. We're finding that if we start with high schools, typically you start, some kind of innovation at the elementary schools. We have found that if we start with high schools, it trickles down so nicely. And, it's kind of odd, but it's a different approach that I hope the readers will find interesting, and they'll consider different ways of thinking out of the box, imagining how something could come together with all the different components that we have described in the book. And the principles themselves have description, they have their stories. So I'm not going to share those because they have wonderful stories that they themselves wrote for us.
I love the blend of research and practice, but I also very much appreciate it is a deeply important topic that the three of you wrote about. It is clear that you've written about it with passion and curiosity, which I think is really great. But also the other part is the fact that the timing is perfect. It is such a perfect time when this book is coming out to have that blend of research and practice and be able to look at what people can do now and maybe what they're doing already. And also what we can do in the fall, maybe when COVID is a little bit further behind us in a different way. So Debbie, Margarita, and Margo, thank you so much. The book is Beyond Crisis: Overcoming Linguistic and Cultural Inequities in Communities, Schools, and Classroom. Thank you so much for being on Leaders Coaching Leaders today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Peter. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. What an honor.
So what a great podcast, a great interview with them, because I feel like we could have kept talking for a very long time, and you can see how the three authors sort of bring their own expertise, but how they mesh together really well. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that, Ariel?
Oh, yeah, no, like I said before, I think the passion was just radiating from them. And I loved seeing that. I told them they had so much cohesion. And, I work with author pairs all the time, but it's rare that we get to work with three authors who have done so much together. This is at least their second book together. Mm-hmm. And just their expertise is fantastic.
What I'm hoping, and it's one thing that I definitely pushed in the interview, is not only talking about what the book is focusing on, but how will the book actually help people? What can they do after they're reading this book? How can they immediately put something into practice? So what I'm hoping for listeners is that, and this is a question for all the listeners, out of all the things that the three authors talked about, what is something you're presently doing? Like I remember, I talked about Magic Moments, our morning program. As soon as Debbie started talking about that, I'm like, I remember Magic Moments. So to the listeners, what are you doing right now? That's sort of a moment like that. And also, what did they say to you that might inspire you to try something different when you're back in school with kids as well?
Great questions.
Well, all right, Ariel. It's always good to share a podcast with you.
Thanks, Peter. You too.
And I'll talk to you next time.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.